All right, so we're back. We are continuing on. This is video 4 of the Git Management XUI series. We're going to switch tacks a little bit from our last call where we were kind of working on the Git wrapper capability to send REST calls to Git. Today, we're going to work a little bit more. I want to start, now that we have some functionality in calling Git, I'm going to start building out the forms in CloudBolt and figuring out configurations and things like that. So I kind of put together this real quick example, but one of the things we need to do is we need a mechanism for storing data about what we want to do when we connect. So this is just kind of what I came up with is something along the lines of a dictionary that has, we may want to allow multiple configs, and I also want to allow the user to select different types of configs, whether it's an outbound config or an inbound config. An outbound config, I want to be able to use when we are in CloudBolt and we're targeting a blueprint that we want to synchronize up to a GitHub repository. So that's going to be my outbound type config. It's going to target a repo and a branch name. We are going to actually control exactly where in the repo and branch that goes as part of the XUI. So we'll get into that here in just a little bit. This is just an example of what it should look like. The second piece here is we also want to allow for an inbound capability. And what this will eventually do, I don't know that we'll get to it in this series, but the thought is I want to have as part of the XUI, a recurring job that goes out and periodically queries the repo name and the branch name specified here, and it ingests all of the CloudBolt content from that repo. These repos should be in a standardized fashion because all of the content there should have been synchronized with the outbound mechanism. The inbound mechanism then just pulls that repo. The repo will have standardized directories, maybe a blueprints directory, a XUI's directory, and those things based off of the directory that the content is found in. It will then go through, periodically poll, see, does this content already exist in CloudBolt? If not, we want to create those blueprints. And what this would allow us to do is to really have a holistic branching strategy where we can push content directly from CloudBolt into our Git repositories when we're ready to do so. Those repositories would have all of the required JSON files and Python files needed for this content. But maybe we're pushing that to a repo that pertains to a Jira ticket ID or something along those lines. That could be our branch name. And then, sorry, I was just thinking through something else. Okay, anyway, we can push to a particular branch. We can then go through some testing validation on that branch. Maybe we then have another CloudBolt instance down the stream where once we've done a PR to merge this content from that branch into maybe a develop branch, the next phase would be maybe the develop branch is then automatically creating those blueprint, going through some kind of automated testing on that content when it pulls it into CloudBolt so that we can validate it. And then maybe there's a final PR to push it to a production branch that's a protected Git branch. And then we have a third CloudBolt instance that has another inbound configuration where it has a recurring job that's pulling that branch appropriately. So I think what I will do is only allow a single inbound configuration per CloudBolt, and I could allow multiple outbound configurations. Maybe there are multiple branches you would want to target. So I think that would make sense is to have a different configuration for each branch that you may want to target inside of the repo. But the inbound config, that's only a one and done deal because you probably don't want to be importing CloudBolt content from multiple sources. We can always change that later, but I think for now I'm going to keep this as a single inbound source for those CloudBolt repos. So anyway, this is what it's going to end up looking like. What we really need to do now is figure out how to store this information in CloudBolt. There's a couple of ways we could do it. In the past, I've used the XUI directory. I've had an additional directory that gets created in the XUI that maybe stores configuration files, or maybe I write out a file name that I know that has a different extension from what we're looking for in our init.py file. Maybe it's like environment.config or something along those lines that wouldn't get exported with the XUI because it's not part of the allowed XUI's extensions, so that every time you go into a new environment, it's that config is reset. So that's one way to do it. The way that I'm actually going to handle it, though, is we're going to store this information in the database of CloudBolt. We're going to use something called custom fields and custom field values. If you've worked inside of the CloudBolt user interface, you may know these as what are called parameters inside of the system. So let's just take a look at that real quick and just talk through what we're talking about. So again, in the UI, these are called parameters. In the database, they are called custom fields. And every custom field can have one or more custom field values that maybe the user selects, or we can use those to store information in. Really, I'm going to store that JSON. At the end of the day, it's going to be a string. So I'm going to take it. I'm going to store it in a long string format. It's not just going to be a string. There's a different type. I believe it's text in our database. So we'll get to all of that. But effectively, we're going to take and create different custom field values, which are really those parameter options. Let me just find a better one here. Oh, no, that's a good one either. We'll see. Yeah, these parameter options here, these are what are considered custom field values. So what we're going to do, though, is we're not going to allow the custom field that we're creating to be shown inside of the UI. So there's a kind of, not a hidden feature, but there's a feature inside of CloudBolt called namespacing for parameters. We can create a custom namespace for the XUI that we're building. That namespace would mask those parameters so that users can't touch these at all, because the custom field that we're creating, we only ever want it to have one single custom field value, because that one single custom field value is going to contain all of our configuration for what we're trying to do. So we don't want them creating multiple custom field values. We just want to make it one single custom field value. Yeah, so fairly straightforward, I would say, but we'll kind of start working through that process here. So, okay, so the first thing that we need to do, let's go back over to our utilities file. Again, this is kind of our master file where we're really keeping a record of everything. I'm going to start to minimize, like the GitHub wrapper. I'm going to leave that minimized. Why don't we go over to, we're going to kind of put everything above GitHub wrapper and leave the GitHub wrapper class towards the bottom. Not sure if that's a best practice, keep those separate or not, but it works. So we'll get there. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to create a new function. Let's call setup config data. And what this is going to do is it's going to say, let's see what it does. Create a config file with a git repo, return. Okay, so this is not quite what we want to do, but it's, you know, create a field for the configuration data for the cloud, for the GitHub Okay, so our config data, we're not going to do this quite yet, but what we need to do is we're going to do something called create custom field. And this is actually something, maybe create CF. Let's see if we have an import here. Okay, so we have this create custom field here. This is a native CloudBolt method. And hoping that it gives me some highlighting for what goes in here. You know, there's a hotkey to do this. Why am I not getting any hints here, PyCharm? I feel like I could just wait a second. There it is. So all I need to do is double click here. And what we'll see is we'll see the allowed inputs here. So again, this is handy to be able to do that. I need to give it a name, a label. You'll notice namespace here is any. We don't have a namespace yet, so we'll have to create that as well. So let's just go ahead and start filling those in. Name and label, I know that we need. So, and let's see, the first three, I believe, are required fields. So name, label, and type. So name, label, and type is going to be, like I mentioned, text. This is just a long string field. So the next one, description. We can do description. Okay, so there's our name, our label, type, have a description. What other fields do we want here, though? I'll give it the name and the label here in just a minute. We will need, we don't care about name required or show on servers or available all servers, show as attribute, any of those things. I don't care about those at all. I'm good with all the other defaults, but we do need namespace. So I'm going to add that in as well. Okay, so there's our namespace. Now I need to create the namespace. Namespace equals, having that, I believe it's the namespace. Actually, you know what? I built into this method, when we pass in a namespace, it will create the required namespace for us. So we don't need to recreate that. It's automatically baked into it. So I'm going to title the namespace here. I'm going to call this, I think I've used other, because I like to, in CloudBolt, I like to use the same prefixes for these across the kind of namespacing, the way that we're handling these. I did something along those lines already, but maybe not. Okay, well, let's make something. Okay, so namespace, let's call this Git management. Perfect. Okay, so we'll create a Git management namespace. We'll create a new custom field. This custom field is going to be called, we need to give it a name and a label. Git management, big data, Git big, something along those lines. That works. Okay, perfect. So this is what it should look like. We're going to use this set up config data. We can store this. I don't know that we need to, though. Really, I just care that the field gets created. Actually, you know what else we can do? Is we can create that initial value as well. So, so we do want to store. So we'll get CF equals. Greatly. Or not. Okay. I'm going to return here. I think we're good here. We'll find out in just a second. So we'll create the custom field, and then we'll create the custom field value. No, I don't think we have a create custom field value. To import custom field value. That's interesting. Okay, I've never worked with that before. So let's do this. I'm going to back that up. And I'm going to add this to my import at the top. And then I'm going to, just like the create custom field name, any, and value, any. Okay. So I'm going to create our initial custom field value. Actually, you know what? I don't want to do this because I don't have enough control over it here. So I'm going to do it a little differently. Let's get rid of that import because we're not going to need it. But what we want to do is we want to actually go to the object itself. So custom field value is the model that we'll be importing here. So we do need to import that model. Attention, yep, that is correct. Model. So we have a custom field value objects, and then we want to do a get or create. And what this is going to return, it's going to return two values from it. And you'll notice that's what I was looking for before when I was in this parentheses. It showed me real quick what it needed, but I lost it already. So it's going to give me the value, and it's going to tell me was it created or not. I don't really care if it was created or not. Actually, I can't do this either because they're going to be different. That's what I'm going to do this a little different. This is a little more manually. I don't like having to do this, but that's all right. So we're going to do a get. And then we want to say field name. Management. I don't want to read it. That's weird, but anyway. So field underscore name equals get management config data. So we're looking for any values that match this. So we're going to say CFE equals, we're going to capture that. Actually, let's go ahead and go through and we're going to say, we're going to create our custom field. So this should create it. Okay, so create custom field isn't defined, so we need to grab our import from the file because we don't import all the methods. We do have the C2 wrapper in this environment, but let's go ahead and do that. Now we have a custom field. We can do custom field. We can see that that get configuration field was created. We can do cf.namespace so that we can see that it's part of a get management namespace. And then we can go over to cf.label get configuration data is what it would be labeled as. We're never going to see it in here, but if we look for get, notice we're not seeing it here. And again, that's because it's part of it's part of a namespace. Any namespaces don't show up in the CloudBolt UI. So that's important to know. This is really handy if you're building your own XUIs and you have data that you want to protect in the XUI, you only want to manage it with code. I would recommend using a namespace, and then nobody can mess things up for you. So, so we have our custom field now. We have the object. Now what we need to do though is we need to figure out how to get this custom field value. So I want to try this first and see what my result is. I think it just returns none. Oh, so okay, so it's giving us a does not exist error. So I want to wrap this in some logic, and I'm going to try this down. Actually, I'm going to write it up top first. I'm going to try and get it, and then I'm going to accept custom field value does not exist, and I think that should, I believe that's the right error mechanism. If it doesn't, what I want to do is I want to create a custom field value. I only ever want a single custom field value for this. Custom field value to objects.get. I don't know if there may be. Paste this down here and then I'll tab. Okay, so there's a get. We don't need get. We want get or create though. I don't know if there's just a create. There is a create. that may be destructive. And if there's something else there already, I don't want to. Yeah, let's do a get or create. Bigger fan of. Again, we don't really care about the custom field value so much right now and storing it after we create it. But what we want to do here is we want to say get or create, and we want to say field equals CF, value equals empty dictionary. I don't think spaces there. I don't know why we're putting spaces there, but okay. So we're going to create a new custom field value that is an empty dictionary. Now, when we go in and we go to look at configs, we're going to first run this setup config data to make sure that these things exist. If they don't exist, it's going to create it. I don't really need to return anything from here just because we're not really getting any data from that. Actually, you know what we can do? We can do CF and CF. That's what we can do. So we can store our custom field value. So if basically what's happening here is if the get management config data the custom field value that's mapped to this field already exists, we'll capture it. If not, we're going to create a new one. Actually, we need to, the second portion of this is going to tell us for get or create, it returns the object that was created, and it returns a second item in the tuple that is true or false. Was it created or not? Which is useful if you're trying to conditionally watch and do something else if it was created or not. But this is just going to give us an empty dictionary at this point. So this actually, instead of setup config data, maybe this is get config data. Because our create custom field is actually going to get or create a custom field. It's not, this has under the covers is doing that get or create function. Did I store it? I did. I think I just did CF equals. So we're good there. Here, though, the CF value is going to be a little different. Let's do return custom field and the custom field value. And then this would allow us to use those because get config data, what this now does is we'll either return an empty dictionary and create that custom field value, or it will get the config data. So we should be able to think through this. Yeah, so we do want to write that back. Okay, we'll do another method here in a second that says set config data that we'll use as part of a trigger mechanism later on down the road. So we have this should function now at this point. Now we didn't create a custom field value yet. So I don't want to do it here. I want to create it as part of, I want to save this file and I want to actually call the get config data method. So I'm going to exit out of shell plus, reload shell plus. And I'm going to do it from GUI dot get management dot utilities import get config data. And then I'm going to do custom field value equals get config data. Okay, so I have CF. Now I have CFV, so the custom field value was created. Now, the one thing I do want to be sure of, if I run this over and over again, I do not want more than one custom field value. So I'm just going to run this over and over again. And then what I can do is I can take my search here, and instead of a get only ever returns one result. So if there are multiple results for this custom field value, it will return all of them. But a filter will return an array of results. So notice in our filter, we only get a single value. So this function will protect us from having multiple config data existing inside of our environment. The next thing that I want to do, though, is set config data. And it's really handy when you start to, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do get config data, right? Actually, cfv.value v.text value. Both are the same. I think we probably should set this as text value. I think that's all right because we know that it's of a type field. So as long as we set the value, it works. So, but we can do this, and then we can reset the value. Then we can save the custom field with the new data. So basically, what we'll do is, as part of this, we'll get the config data. We'll look at the existing config. If you're editing it or if you're deleting it, we'll change that. Pass that information in. So let's say new data. And this should be, we'll have another method that basically feeds this in. I guess we can feed in a dict, and then what we can do is we can dump the data for them when we get in here. So let's say new data JSON.dumps. Okay, so now we have our JSON imports. We'll actually get config data. So we don't need to return the custom field here. So what we'll change here, we do want the custom field value. So I don't know that, I'm going to leave that because we might need the custom field at some point. We might need the custom field value. We might also need the config data itself. So I'm going to pull that out of the CFV, and I'm going to translate it. Config data equals CFV.value, but we're going to load that with JSON. Okay, so this is going to give us the config data itself. So when we get it back, we can use any one of these three elements that we're returning, just referencing them positionally. And then, so we get our config data, we can use that, change it, and then what we can do is feed that back in as a dictionary here. This is a dictionary that's getting returned as part of the tuple. So there we go. That's what I want to do. Just document that a little better. There we go. All right. So this is going to save our new value, new data, dump it to string. Then we have a string to save as our value. So we now have the two methods that I think we need to save this configuration data. What I may do instead of, I think what I want to do here is I go back to my templates. I'm going to look at, I have a tab called source control, but I think I want to change that a little bit. I want to have config and source control on the same page. So I'm going to call this, instead of configs or source control, actually I'm going to go to my views first and change which tab I'm looking at here. But I'm going to call this configuration or config, just keep the tab a little shorter. And we'll just call this, rename that to config. So I'm going to go to tab source control. I do want to rename this. Instead of tab source control, I want tab dash config. I'm going to refactor that. We're going to save it all. And then what we need to be careful of when you're working with XUIs, I'm going to just change to our ProServe directory. Management, and then we're going to go into our templates folder. One of the things with PyCharm is if you rename something, it doesn't delete the old files on the remote system, which is kind of a pain. So I need to get rid of the ones that were renamed here. So I'm going to remove tab dash source control. Yes. Okay, so now this should match exactly what this looks like here. So we should be good there. I'm actually going to change up a level, make sure I don't have anything extra here. So I have URLs, utilities, views, init. PyCache won't get exported with that. That's just kind of the loading of the Python modules. Okay, so we're good here. All right, let's do. So we have our views. We've created our config here. Now we have a config tab. But right now, this ends up looking like nope, broke something. It's probably what I just did. Let's restart, make sure we have the latest version of all of these files. Just fail the application log. Oh, here it is right here already. Template does not exist. Get management templates tab source control. That's because our views was dated. So that should be fixed now. Let's verify. There we go. Looks like it's rendering. Okay, so we have blueprints and we have config. So now notice our config tab has changed. We do have a connection info list. So we want to keep this list because this is part of the configuration or the management. But I want to put an additional table above this that references the configurations themselves. So I'm kind of just copy what's here and tailor it real quick. So this is this whole thing, the container fluid. I think it is. Where do we start? Panel heading, connection info list. I don't know if it's the container fluid or the panel default. So I'm going to just copy everything down to this. I'm going to repaste it and then we can edit it. So there's a separation between our two divs. Save all. Again, you don't need to restart Apache for HTML pages, but I can refresh it now and I should see a second list above the first list. So we're going to do it correctly. There we go. Okay, so that works. But we're going to tailor this a little bit. We want this to be our configuration information. So we're going to go back into, we also need to add additional context for our configuration. So what we can do, find the right button, is go back over to, I'm going to start just editing this. So connection info list. I don't need a hyperlink here anymore. So instead of an href and calling it a connection info list, let's be sure. No, that's this here. We can just get rid of this whole thing. I don't even need that. I do want to keep the title on the left-hand side, the connection info list title, the header, but I'm going to now call this get configurations. button toolbar. I don't remember what any of this looks like. So create new connection info. Don't believe we need any of that. Actually, we can update this to have a new method to say create it's not going to be backed yet, but create new git config. So that'll be create new git config. Big create. So this is going to be something else we need to create in our URLs file, where it's going to complain about it. So we are going to, I'm going to just store that real quick. Copy one of these URLs. I'm going to take it and git config create. And this is going to be, I'll need to create a new method in my views file to do this too. So git management. It's not going to be connection info though. This is going to be so notice for the create method, a little different because we don't have an ID for these yet. We're not really going to, I don't think we're really going to have an ID. So I think we'll use this. It's going to be my URL. So this is the path for the URL. The URL effectively, here's my shortcut for the URL, but the views that I'm going to use to process this data, why don't I call it create git config. Instead of git CI, I want git config. So that should be all we need to change now. Now we need to create that create git config method in our views file. Notice we do have a couple of them. They're empty. We're not doing anything with these yet. So we're gonna just create an empty method function in our views file for now. We'll fill these back in later as we get to them, but this will prevent my configuration from screaming at me when we attempt to load the URLs file. So that's been fixed now. We can go back over to our template tab and continue to build that out. I like to do these things when I create them, because if not, I forget about them down the road. So back over to our config tab. So now we have this URL link that we're going to use to eventually launch a function that will create a new git connection info. I mean, we probably want to load a form with this so that we're capturing information from the end user, all of those fun things as well. So we'll get there. So create new git config. I don't want space there. I want that to be right at the beginning. Okay. I don't care about connection infos now. So I do still want to use a table. It's going to be a little different than the bottom table. Don't really care about the if else. So I'm going to remove some of that logic. So the if connection infos, and then I do want to knock all this back a line. Just I think that's where it should be. Okay. And I'm going to just modify this real quick. List of configurations. Need any of this extra stuff in here. Okay, so we have a table here. Now, really, the configurations, if you remember back to the format here, I really care about four things. One, the name of the configuration, then the type, the repo, and the branch. So we're going to go through there. Actually, when I build out my context, I'm going to take my config and I'm going to structure it a little differently than what it looks like here. So I'm actually going to key each of these in the name so that we can, that's going to be the unique ID here. So let's go ahead. So config type repo branch. really care about username or action, or we just need these 4 columns. Then I'm going to go into my list here. Again, I only need 4 entries here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, here in a minute, I'll add it into my context, but I'm going to have effectively an array of configs. So for config in git configs, I'll pass this in as git configs. I'll call it config.name. I'm just wondering if it's better to just do an array versus a dictionary. I'm not entirely sure yet, but we'll get there. Okay, so for git config, for config and git configs, I like the dictionary because I can reference these independently. So if I need to get right to a config, I can say, give me the config 1, give me config 2. Versus if I don't have this, I'm looping through an array, and I think that's additional code that I don't really need. So I'd almost rather convert it to an array when needed. Anyway, so for config and git configs, let's do it. Config name type repository, and then we'll do config.name, config.type, config.repo, and config.branch. Okay, so just kind of building out an HTML table here, not rocket surgery, but all right. So we have our config tab. The HTML should be good to go. Now we need to tell it what git configs is, because we don't have that in our context coming from our views file yet. So we'll go back to our context here. We want to add an additional git configs element here, and we're going to do git configs. That's what this is going to end up being. I'm going to leave this. I think this is going to be pretty specific to, actually, you know what? I'll do this. Let's see what this looks like already. So git config data. So git configs. I'm gonna have it return an array. So def git configs. So this is, again, we have the CF, the CSV, and the config data. I don't care about the custom field or the custom field value, but I do want to get the config data. Now, once I have the config data, remember that is a JSON dictionary. So what I can do here is convert this to an array, and I can say configs equals empty array, and then I'll do for key and value in there. I want to do actually, we're going to do config equals, and we're going to create the config. And this is going to be, it's going to be a dictionary. Config equals value, because we have most of what we need. Then config, we're going to add the name to the value. And then what we're going to do is just add the config to configs. So now we're appending the config to this array, and then we're going to return configs. That should do the trick. We should see an array of all of these git configs. Anyway. Git configs, return the git configurations as a list fix. Okay, so go back and do our imports, git figs, git configs. It's empty, which is what we would expect at this point. So it is returning a list, though. We can see that it's returning a list here. We'll add some data as part of methods here in just a minute, but there we go. Actually, you know what? Let's use our set config data method to test that. And let's say new underscore data equals, and again, this can be a dictionary, so I'm just going to manually say, let's do this. I'm going to copy from here. It's just going to be a sample configuration, but this. So we're adding config 1, and then we'll close this out and store it. So now new underscore data should be in dictionary. There we go. So we're going to say that this is now new data. So we're going to do set config data. We're going to do new data. Let's see. Oh, get config data. Yeah, I messed this up. Get config data is now 3. So we need to tell it there's a third one. We care about config data here, and we don't really care about custom field either. We're not using either of those. We're just going to blank both of those out. That allows us to reload here. Okay, so now let's do there we go. Now we have get configs. We now see a get config out there. So this should now show in our table once things are up and running. So get configs is now working. We are going to have to import that from our views page so that we can pass that in. So let's do, we're going to get it from Git Management Utilities. So we see that as an additional import now from our utilities, and that should pass that into our context. Context then renders that and uses it inside of the template. Let's go ahead and restart Apache. Wait for that to happen, and then refresh our page, and we should see what we're looking for. Now that I'm looking at this as well, I'm also going to keep these actions here because we do want to allow them to both edit or delete the configuration. So, yeah, couple of things there that we want to do. All right, let's see. So we have our config name. Yeah, so here's our new table. So our table's working right now. So we, like I said, we want to go back in. I do want to add those buttons back in. Let's copy paste. So it's going to be action. And then up a little bit. So this last table column, what we want to do is we want to have two buttons in there. One is we're going to use the same icons. I like that edit and delete icon for this. But instead of CI edit, this is going to be a config edit. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to edit the config.name because that's our unique key here. I'm going to say config.name, config.name. And instead of CI edit, we're going to do config edit and config edit or delete. So config edit, config delete. We're going to then go back to our URLs file. Remember, we need to update this anytime we add an additional functionality. I'm going to copy the CI edit and the CI delete here. But what we're going to do is we now have, instead of CI underscore ID, I believe we want CI underscore name. Config. Let's just change that. So we're going to be, so the CI ID, we want this to be config underscore name. And this is just a regex query that's going to create a dynamic URL for us to say edit or delete those configurations. And then it's going to be edit, get config, delete, get config. And then this is going to be get config edit, and then get config delete. So we're going to need to create these two views. So again, back over to our views file. Again, this is just going to be a framework for now. Then GitHub Copilot makes our jobs easier as when we're developing things. So highly recommended. Okay, edit, get config, delete, get config. We have our tab that then references these buttons, which will trigger these methods based off of this URL mapping that we have here. So let's go ahead. We're gonna save all. We're then going to go back over. Actually, we're going to restart Apache real quick because we updated a couple of things there. I'm going to refresh our page. Okay, hitting an issue means I probably mistyped something. Okay, so this is the back to the config edit. Config ID and the config name, I think, ends up being a little different. I'm actually going to go into, so my ARM template, something with a name versus, I think ARM templates did IDs, and that's where I got this from. So this is all ID. I think name ends up being slightly different. Trying to think through where I would have seen that. I'm going to pause this for just a second and we'll be back. Okay, so I figured out what it was. Because with IDs, it's a slightly different string. I'm not a regex expert by any stretch of the word, but for some reason, this URL is expecting a /d plus for that. And it seems like a period and a star works for the config name instance. So the page is back up and responding now. We actually are still, these aren't working. So what happens is when we hit the edit, it shows that the server is not responding. If we go to the logs, this is exactly what I would expect to see. It should be returning an HTTP response object, but it's returning none. That's just what we have. We just have this filler in there for today. So that's okay. If we hover here now, what we can see is you look down towards the bottom left, you can see in our URL that it's going to get management, con info, config one, edit, or config one, delete. So based on the button that we're hovering over, it will launch those URLs, which is effectively just a view. And that view then goes through and it should be returning an HTTP response object. We'll get to that here in just a little bit, but not super important quite yet. So we have our config showing up. The first thing I want to do though is work on create new git config. The other thing I'm seeing here is the C is right next to the plus sign, and that tells me that that's why they had originally, or I had, whoever wrote that, it's probably me, who knows. But instead of create new git config, what we can do is we can put a space here, and now what that does is just makes it look a little bit cleaner. Again, HTML does not require, oh, maybe I broke the whole thing, who knows? Let's try one more time. There we go, have a space. Looks a little better, a little cleaner. We have our action buttons back, so we're getting there. Yeah, so the next thing that we want to start working towards is creating forms. So when I create a new git config, first, again, this is going to show it's going to give an error too, because it's returning none today. But what we need to do is to get this to a point to where we're returning an HTTP response, and that's usually using a form in Django. That form then allows the user to interact with it and pass data into it and collect data from the end user. So I think for now, this is probably a good point. We've added some additional capability. We've added in a new table, and we're going to continue to expand on this as part of a next call in this session. But this is at least a good start, kind of starting to roughen frameworks for this stuff. And next call, we'll really start to put the content to work. We'll start creating that form to capture the data that we need from the end user. We know the data we need to capture because it's the config name, the type, the Git repository, Git branch. We capture that information. We also do want to say, we only want to show inbound if there's not an inbound already set, things like that. So we'll get to all of that, some of those conditional parameter displays and things like that on the next call. So that's it for today. Thanks.